before I start to talk about anything, we're all just going to take a deep breath. Are we all relaxed? Can I talk about conference realignment now? I think we're good. I'm Drew, and I'm back for the second episode of the Scoring from the 50 podcast. I said last week that we were going to talk about the ACC, but we have bigger things to talk about. Oregon and Washington in the Big Ten, Utah, Colorado, Arizona State, all in the Big 12. Oregon State, Washington State, Stanford, and Cal. Where are they going to go? We're going to talk about all that in this episode. And is Florida State learning how to speak Arabic? I don't know, but we're going to figure it all out within this podcast. First off, let's talk about Oregon and Washington in the Big Ten. Arguably the biggest move out of all of this. They will be the 17th and 18th teams in the Big Ten after USC and UCLA join. They will be half members of the Big Ten, money-wise. They will make $30 of the $60 million for the next 6 years. And after that, we'll go to full members of the Big Ten. Let's talk about it. Let's talk about what will happen with Oregon, and then we'll talk about Washington. Starting with Oregon, Oregon State, Civil War. Will that continue? No one really knows. We'll get to Oregon State in the future. We'll talk about them with Washington State, Stanford, and Cal. But for now, Oregon, what does that have the effect on the Pac-12, the Big Ten? Let me tell you, the Big Ten just got a lot more competitive. Michigan and Ohio State are shaking in their boots right now, having USC, UCLA, Oregon, and Washington all to compete with. Whenever they already had to compete with each other and Penn State, they're scared right now. They have to be. There's no way they're not. Washington, same thing, huge. I think Oregon and Washington are great fits in the Big Ten. I think they both make enough money. They will bring revenue for the conference. They'll fit in perfectly for the rest of the schools. They'll compete for titles or compete for the college football playoff every year, even in the 12 team, even more in the 12 team. They'll have a shot at national championships. They're great in the Big Ten. They'll make the Big Ten a ton of money. They'll make themselves a ton of money. They'll be super competitive. There's not a lot more to say other than that. Moving on to the new Big 12 teams. Utah, Colorado, Arizona State. They're all in the Big 12, the four corner schools. Talked about Colorado a little bit last week, but they will all have full revenue shares, all around $42 million per year. Utah, great addition for the Big 12. They're super competitive in football. Basketball will be a little bit weird, but as we know, reigning back-to-back Pac-12 champions, Utah will be in the Big 12. They'll be great, compete. Colorado with Neon Dion, they'll be great in the Big 12. Great fit. They've always been a great fit in the Big 12. They should have never left. Colorado with Dion will be great. They'll make them a lot of money. A lot of attention will be on Colorado this year and years to come as long as Dion's there, which means more attention on the Big 12, which is just great all around. Arizona, another great addition. They'll be great in basketball. They'll at least be around as maybe 6-win team in football, but they'll be good. Arizona State, kind of in the same boat. They'll be alright at basketball, not as good as Arizona, but they'll be a decent football team. I don't know. There's not much to say about those two, but they're good. They're really, really good additions. I love all this. I love how all these are what I had in my perfect football world, which I talked about last week if you want to go watch that. This is all great. I think this is great for football. We'll get to my thoughts on everything in the sport in general later. That'll be at the end. Stay tuned for that. Now, let's talk about Oregon State, Washington State, Stanford, and Cal. What do? They only have a few options. They could stay with the Pac-12, dying Pac-12 that is. They could go independent, look for the Mountain West, look for the Athletic Conference, the AAC. Could Stanford and Cal go to the Big Ten? I think there were rumors about that before this whole thing started. There was rumors about Oregon State and Washington State to the Big 12, just like in my college football world. But Big 12 has, from what I've seen, they voted to start exploring to look for 18 teams, which would be 2 more than what they just added. They just moved to 16 with the 4 corner schools that they're adding. I would love to see Oregon State and Washington State make it to the Big 12. I really don't want those two to go away. I feel terrible for the fans of those two schools. Their favorite teams will no longer be competitive in the grand scheme of college football. They're just not going to be making enough money. They're not going to be able to recruit well enough. They won't be playing against good enough teams. They just won't be good unless they're in some weird year where everyone else loses enough. But going forward, college football, you're going to be able to lose 3-4 games and still make the playoffs in a down year for everyone else. With 12 teams, that's just how it works. They're not going to be able to compete to the level that they want to compete with. I feel terrible for their fans, so I really, really hope that the Big 12 offers at least Washington State and Oregon State life rafts, because I love Oregon State. They're the same colors as my high school. Washington State, great fan base. Love Wazoo. Love the Apple Cup. Love the Civil War. I think they'll still be able to exist in some capacity if they can make it into a Power 3 conference, which is what it's turning out to be instead of a Power 2, like everyone else was saying. As for Stanford and Cal, I really don't see a way they live through this. I mean, there were talks about them going to the Big Ten. They have died. I haven't seen anything about cultural realignment from Pete Thamel, Brett McMurphy, anyone in the past 24 hours. Nothing really has happened. Nothing really has been gained. But I hope they can, just for the sake of college football. But someone's going to have to die from all this. And it's looking like it's going to be the quote-unquote Pac-4. Oregon State, Washington State, Stanford, Cal. They have nowhere to go. Besides, I don't know, the Mountain West Athletic Coast Conference. They could stay in the Pac-12. Now, let's look at moves that the Pac-12 could make moving forward. They could look to add a number of Mountain West conferences, maybe SMU. They could just add a bunch of them, expand them, and put the MWC in the same spot that they are now, looking to either merge with someone else or just dissolve altogether. Who knows? But they could also merge with maybe an AAC. The most interesting part of all this, they could look to merge with the ACC. It would probably be the only way that the ACC or the Pac-12 will long-term stay as a Power 5 conference. In this case, it'd be Power 4. But the Pac-12 doesn't have another option if they want to stay as a power conference. There's no way that they're going to lure any big team or teams, which is what they need. There's no way. They don't have a TV deal in place. They don't have anything put together for the future. They're not going to be able to get any teams. They're going to have to merge with any conference if they want to stay alive. If they want to stay as a power conference, they're going to have to merge into the PAC-ACC. PAC-CC. There we go. What a great name. Just came up with that on the spot. But ACC, Pac-12, not looking good for either of them. The ACC, I feel like, is in the exact same situation that the Pac-12 was a year ago. I remember last year hearing things about Oregon and Washington moving to the Big Ten after USC and UCLA already had. And I feel like I'm in the same situation with Clemson and Florida State now. They went out. I mean, you heard Florida State just a week or so ago saying specifically it's not if, but when and how they're going to leave the ACC. If Florida State leaves, that's a huge blow. If Clemson leaves, they might have 2 or 3 competitive football teams, which is exactly how it was going to be if just Oregon and Washington left the Pac-12. Yeah, they've had a few good teams, but they would not be a good power conference, just like the ACC would be if Florida State and Clemson were to leave. Therefore, I think if we're in the same situation in a year, 2 years, 3 years, ACC is going to die off as well, and it will become that Power 3 that I was talking about last week, with just the Big Ten, SEC, and the Big 12 kind of emerging as another Power 3 conference, and they're going to dominate basketball. This isn't a basketball podcast, obviously, but they will dominate every single year. But now, to stay focused on the ACC, I feel like if Clemson, Florida State, if they leave, everyone else will be gone. A few months ago, you heard about the Magnificent Seven, had people such as Duke, Miami, they'll all be gone within 5 years of Florida State and Clemson leaving. I'm not saying it'll be exactly like the Pac-12 did, where everything just blew up, because the ACC does have that TV deal in place for, the next 13 years, 10 years? They're set. They're going to at least have a conference moving forward. the reason why the Pac-12 died is because they did not have that TV deal, but the ACC does, and they should be just fine with smaller schools. They won't be maybe a power conference, but they'll be good enough to stay as a conference, maybe adding a few smaller schools over there, East Carolina, App State, James Madison, just a few that come to mind, that could join the ACC and be good conferences. South Florida, that's a great one. But the ACC will be able to compete with smaller schools, maybe not be a power conference like I just said, but they'll be good enough to stay together and not dissolve, like the Pac-12 probably will, if they don't merge with anyone else. Speaking of Florida State and Clemson, what is next for them? The Big Ten. What's next for the Big Ten? What do they do after adding Oregon and Washington? Could they move to a 20-team conference? Yes, they can. They can add Florida State, Clemson, Virginia, any ACC school that they want. They'll have the money. They'll be able to do it. They'll be able to learn them away from the terrible TV deal that the ACC has. Florida State and Clemson will be great additions to the Big Ten. They'll be a little bit, out of region. I'll get to that later, but Florida State and Clemson would be great additions. They'll compete. Academics are great. They'll compete in all sports. Like I just said, they'll compete, but they'll compete in all sports. It'll add more competition to the top end of the Big Ten, which is always needed because the middle tier to low tier of the Big Ten just flat out isn't good enough. So, Florida State, Clemson, Oregon, Washington, UCLA, USC would all be additions to the new Big 20, I guess you could call it. But they're all great additions, all going to make the Big Ten better, all going to make the competition better. It'll be great. It'll go against my great college football world that I talked about last week. I had Clemson, Florida State in the SEC, but I still think it'd be perfect if they were to go to the Big Ten. Either or, it'd be great for them. Hopefully, we'll still be able to see those Clemson, South Carolina games, those Florida, Florida State games. Those would be great games to see between the Big Ten and the SEC instead of the SEC and the ACC. They'll add more fear towards Michigan and Ohio State because they're living in their little ivory tower up there. They're only two good schools, but these West Coast, these East Coast schools, they could ruin it in a matter of 2 years. They could be winning the conference. They're good enough right now to win the conference if they were in the Big Ten. But I do think they'd be great additions to the Big Ten Conference. As I've said multiple times already, they'd be perfect. I'd love to see it. I love to see Michigan travel down to Death Valley for a game at 7 p.m. Michigan does not have enough night games. I'd love to see them play at night more. I'd love to see them play in Florida. We'd probably lose because we're just not used to the humidity down there, but that'd be fun to see. Who wouldn't want to sit down and watch a Florida State-Michigan game who are both maybe have one or two losses and are fighting for a playoff spot? Everyone would, in their right mind, would sit down and watch every single snap of that game. I think Florida State and Clemson could come in year one and win the conference. They could beat Ohio State. They could beat a Michigan. They will be able to compete every single year without a doubt. They'll be good. They recruit well, both schools. They'll be perfect additions to the Big Ten. Now, who else could add more schools? The Big 12. I read a rumor last night that while voting for the Utah and Arizona states to get in, they also voted to start exploring adding 2 more teams and becoming an 18-team conference instead of a 16-team conference, which they already are with the additions of the 4 corner schools. Now, who could those schools be? They could be an Oregon State, a Washington State. I think if they were to add 2 more teams, it would be either Oregon State and Washington State, or they could look to add a Gonzaga or a UConn as basketball-only members. I think they would be perfect for the Big 12 in basketball, add even more competition. Competition is never bad, in my opinion. I think it'd be fun to watch a UConn play Kansas every year, twice a year actually, one at home, one away. That'd be perfect. Add more competition to a Big 12 conference. It's already amazing, especially with the addition of Arizona and Arizona State, Colorado. They're already great basketball. Add more basketball to it, because I need something to watch after January. I need to be able to watch something, and I'd love to go watch a Gonzaga UConn game. I'd love to watch a Gonzaga Oklahoma State game for whatever reason. Maybe they get another Cade Cunningham. I think it'd be great if they were to join as basketball schools, but we'll move on and talk about the 2 football schools that they could add, Oregon State and Washington State. I think they'd be great. It would definitely make it easier for the Civil War and Apple Cup to continue, even if they're in separate conferences. We'll talk about that in a little bit, how just because conference realignment is happening doesn't mean that rivalries necessarily will end. It's not ruining it. Back to the Big 12, I think Oregon State and Washington State would be great fits. They're both good. They can both compete every once in a while. They can compete for a conference championship every few years. They'd be great for the Big 12, expanding their outreach more north instead of just, southwest. They'd be more northwest, perfect for reaching those Washington and Oregon audiences. Great academic schools. I think that they'd just be perfect. They'd fit right in. They're a couple of ragtag, us versus the world kind of schools, just like everyone else is in the Big 12 right now. I mean, 2 years ago, they were on the brink of collapsing, and it felt like everyone in the country was just laughing at them and making fun of them. Like, man, how do you guys let Oklahoma and Texas walk away? You guys are doomed. You guys aren't going to be a thing in 3-4 years, just like I just said about the ACC. They're going to feel like they're us against the world. They're going to fit right into the Big 12, especially with those other Pac-12 teams that have already joined. They'll be great. They'll compete for conference championships. They'll be great academic schools. They'll keep rivalries alive, at least have a better chance of it. I think they'll be great. What more can the Big 12 do than add them? I think that's the best move they can do right now if they want to expand to 18 teams instead of just 16. And I'd love to see Oregon State and Washington State become power schools once again. I love those 2 schools. They're one of those schools like, well, no, I don't want to see them go away. Kind of like Stanford and Cal. No one really cares about them. They have no fans. Their fans don't care. Back to Oregon State, Washington State. They'd be great. I'd love them in the Big 12. I'd love to see what the Big 12 could do with them. I'd love to see a Big 12 with 18 schools. I want the Big 12 to thrive. I want Big 10 to thrive. I want the SEC to thrive. I think having those conferences will be good. Also having less conferences will be good. There is some negatives. Yes, there are some rivalries that will die and not be played anymore, and that is super disappointing, but there's no reason why they can't survive. Now, I would love to talk about something that I don't think many people are going to talk about with conference realignment, and it's just what is going to happen with those smaller schools, those FCS schools? What are they going to do now that there's this huge power vacuum that needs to be filled with the Pac-12 dissolving, or at least going away in whatever capacity that it will? Because obviously it can't survive with 4 schools. It is literally against NCAA rules. But I'm going to read you guys a tweet from Wyatt Wheeler. Great follow if you're a Missouri State fan. He says, I think Missouri State is good right now, being patient. It's one of the best regarded FCS level schools available and will still be attractive to group of 5s once others get poached. Figure out the best situation, no need to panic and screw yourself. MVC is a good spot to be patient. The way I interpret that is that Missouri State could look to be a FBS school. Why is that going to happen? That's going to happen because the Pac-12 is gone. They're going to take some MWC, take some AAC, all those could be on the move, right? That's going to leave a huge hole in those lower level FBS schools, that group of 5s. They're going to need more schools. That's where North Dakota State, South Dakota State, Montana State, Missouri State, they're all kind of thinking right now, oh my god, we can make a ton more money at the FBS level than we do at the FCS level, and move on to be those FBS schools that replace them. Because clearly, they're going to need that. And we're going to see a huge shakeup in the FCS level, and we're going to find out that some of those quote-unquote FCS level schools are actually FBS level schools who can go to the FBS and compete with those lower level schools and eventually become good schools who maybe make a Power 5 conference. You see that with James Madison recently. I think they could eventually be in the ACC, especially with all the stuff that could happen with them. I mentioned them earlier as a candidate to be in the ACC once maybe Florida State, Clemson, Miami, one of them leaves. It's just crazy to me how different every single level of college football will be impacted by all of this, and how we're going to see different conferences everywhere. It'll eventually, I'm assuming, take D2 schools up to an FCS, or D3 up to a D2, and a D2 up to an FCS, FCS up to an FBS, Group of 5 up to a Power 5, Power 5 to a Big 12, SEC, Big 10, I don't really know what to call them yet, but one of those big power conferences. Right now, there's no way that these big FCS schools aren't thinking about going FBS. There's no way that just doesn't happen. The FCS will change, the Group of 5 is going to change, and I don't think a lot of people are going to talk about it, but I think people should think about it more, that this isn't just impacting these Power 5 schools. It's obviously especially going to impact the Mountain West, but it's going to impact every single conference in America, and you're going to see everything change that you've known since 2000 to be college football. And now to get to my final point and what I talk about at the beginning of the show. Everyone needs to calm down. I saw way too many tweets saying this is the darkest day in the history of college football. No, it wasn't. Have you not heard of the Southwest Conference? They didn't dissolve because of something out of their control, like TV or a big brand. They died because they were all cheating. That was a dark day. Everyone is acting like we haven't seen a power conference dissolve before in the SWC. Back in the 90s, you had Texas A&M, all these Texas schools, these big Texas schools that are huge brands, and the conference they were in just poof, it was gone. And guess what? College football was just fine. You're still here 30 years later, sitting down on the couch, watching 12 hours of straight of college football. And I know in 3-4 years, I'm going to be sitting on my couch and I'm going to get ready to watch a Week 10 game between a 8-1 Michigan, a 7-2 Oregon. Both teams will be competing for a spot in a 12-team playoff. And I'm going to watch one of the teams kick a game-winning field goal, and I'm going to love it. I'm going to love seeing more competition. And yeah, I might have to sacrifice some rivalries for that, but in my opinion, there's no reason why the Civil War, the Apple Cup, can't continue to happen. Bedlam. Oklahoma didn't ruin that. Oklahoma State did. Oklahoma went to the SEC and was like, oh, but yeah, I still want to play Oklahoma State. They're our rivals. They're our long-time rivals. Of course we still want to play that game. Oklahoma State said no. That was not Oklahoma's fault. Just because they went to the SEC, it was because Oklahoma State didn't want to play that game. I think the same thing might happen with Oregon State or Washington State, and if they don't get into a power conference, yeah, it's probably going to happen, and that's on conference realignment. But say the Big 12 sends them a lifeline and they make the Big 12, but they say no to continuing those two rivalries, that's not on Oregon and Washington. That's on the state schools. Just because Oregon and Washington were the ones that left to get triple to double the amount of money, who wouldn't do that, first off? But second off, just because they went there, that doesn't mean they don't want to play those games. That means that they want more money, but they can still play those games. They can still play the Civil War, still play the Apple Cup, and college football will be just fine. You're going to get those rivalries and still have more competition in the Big Ten. Like I just said, you're going to see a Michigan-Oregon game. It's going to feel really weird, maybe, but we'll get used to it. Just like we got used to seeing Texas in the Big 12 whenever the SWC dissolved. Just like we got used to seeing Mizzou in the SEC We've gotten used to all these things, and we're going to do it again. It's just going to change. Yes, some rivalries might have to take a hit, and I'm not going to say that doesn't suck. I would love to see Oklahoma and Oklahoma State play Bedlam every single year. That's one of my favorite games in the country, but again, that wasn't Oklahoma's fault. That was Oklahoma State's fault for saying no. You can't blame all of this just on the schools and how they don't want to play those games because they're in a different conference. Now, it's usually the other way around. The team that stayed in the conference doesn't want to play that game, and that is not on conference realignment. I see all these tweets about how conference realignment's terrible just because it's going to ruin rivalries, but it doesn't. You see out-of-conference rivalries all the time. Iowa, Iowa State, Florida, Florida State, Miami, Florida, Georgia, Georgia Tech. You see those rivalries all the time, every single year. Just like Clemson, South Carolina, that's a great one. You see those rivalries every year, even though they're in a different conference. Conference realignment isn't what's killing it. It's those schools that don't want to have those games anymore. That's what's killing it. Sure, it might not mean as more, but the people who say, well, it's not going to mean the same, are the same people that will claim that November games mean the same as they do whether the teams are competing for a playoff spot or not. Because, you get these meaningless November games or meaningless bowl games thrown around, and that is a stupid concept. And there is no meaningless game ever. But you can't use, well, it just won't feel the same. It doesn't mean anything anymore. You can't use that as an excuse whenever I tell you that conference realignment isn't the reason why that's happening. Because I get it. Oregon and Washington State not being in the Pac-12, not being in the same conference, that's going to not mean as much if they're not fighting for a spot in a Pac-12 championship. But you can't claim that a Wake Forest and North Carolina game means everything in late November, but say that a Oregon State game doesn't mean very much just because they're in a different conference. The game is still going to mean a lot just because it's those two schools. It doesn't mean a lot because they're in the same conference and they're fighting against one another for a Pac-12 championship. It means a lot because it's Oregon and Oregon State. They're in-state rivalries. They hate each other. So I'm here to say that everyone needs to calm down because this is not going to kill the sport. It's still going to be a great sport. We're still going to see more competitive games. We're going to see maybe a few less meaningful rivalry games. But if they're still going to be played, which they very well could, it'll mean just as much as it did before. In those top 5 games where if you lose a game, you're out, sure it won't be the same, but those same games are just going to be 7-2 versus 8-1 games, where you're borderline playoff, or you're fighting for a bye in the playoff. They're still going to mean a ton. The records are just going to be different. You're still going to get those top 5 games, still going to get top 10 games, and they're still going to be amazing. They're still going to be beautiful college football. It's just the records might not be the same as they are now. Which, personally, I may differ on this from other people, but I'm completely fine with that. And this is a prime reason as to why I wanted to make my podcast is people who are older than me are freaking out over everything that's happening right now. They think that the football is changing way too much. They're losing rivalries and losing what is important to the game. But they're not. From my point of view as a 16-year-old kid that's in high school, I don't see why this is bad. I don't see why this is great, but I don't see why it's doom and gloom. Oh no, this is 2023 is the last real college football season. That's just not true. I think everyone knows that they're still going to be sitting on their couch every single Saturday, screaming their head off about their favorite team and trying to beat their rivalry if they play it. And if they don't, they'll make new ones. In 50 years, they're just going to have new rivalries. You're still going to see a great college football playoff. You're still going to be rooting for your team to win the national championship. Everything will be just fine. That is my take on college football realignment. That is my take on the Big 12, the Big 10, four corner schools, Oregon, Washington, USC, UCLA, ACC, Florida State, Clemson, everything we just talked about it. That is the end of the second episode of Scoring from the 50 podcast. Next week, we will hopefully talk about the ACC, unless more realignment happens. Thank you so much for listening, and I will see you next Sunday.